I'm Marilyn, 32 female. I'm an architect, and I live with my wonderful fiancé, David, in a city apartment that we've slowly made our own. My life is about structure, balance, and ensuring that foundations are solid before you build anything on top of them. I suppose that's why it took me so long to realize that the foundation of my own family was hopelessly, irrevocably cracked. This is the story of how my parents and golden siblings pushed me too far, and how I used the most important day of my life not just to marry the man I love, but to serve a dish of revenge that was 3 decades in the making. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. Growing up in my family was like living in a perfectly curated museum exhibit where I was the single, inexplicable piece of modern art that didn't match the classical decor. My father, Arthur, was a retired surgeon, a man who moved through life with the unshakable certainty that his opinions were facts. My mother, Eleanor, a former interior designer, treated our family's image as her final, most important project. Everything had to be perfect, harmonious, and above all, impressive to outsiders. And at the center of this perfect portrait were my siblings, Gregory and Veronica. Gregory, my older brother by 4 years, was the crown prince. He was the visionary, the entrepreneur. From the time we were kids, any half-baked idea he had was treated as a stroke of genius. His disastrous lemonade stand that lost $20 was framed by my father as an early lesson in market volatility. When he decided to launch a tech startup after college with a vague business plan and a lot of buzzwords, my parents didn't just encourage him, they bankrolled him. He was charming, handsome, and carried the effortless confidence of a man who had never once had to face a genuine consequence for his actions. Then there was Veronica, 4 years my junior. She was the family's delicate artist, the curator with an ethereal quality and an eye for beauty. Her passions were always deemed profound. Her high school paintings, which were objectively mediocre, were framed and hung in the most prominent places in our house. Her decision to pursue a career in the art world was met with applause, and, as I would later learn, significant financial lubrication to ensure she landed a prestigious-sounding job at a downtown gallery. She was beautiful, willowy, and had mastered the art of weaponizing her sensitivity to get exactly what she wanted. And then there was me, the practical one, the reliable one, the black sheep. While Gregory was being praised for his risk-taking and Veronica for her soulful pursuits, I was the one quietly getting perfect grades. When I decided to become an architect, a profession that requires a grueling amount of education, precision, and dedication, my parents' reaction was lukewarm at best. "Well, it's a stable career, I suppose," my father had said, his tone suggesting it was as exciting as becoming a mid-level accountant. "Just be sure you don't end up designing strip malls, Marilyn," my mother added, with a little laugh that didn't quite hide her disappointment. Their praise, their attention, their resources, it was all a finite supply, and my siblings had a monopoly. When Gregory needed a new car for his image, he got a luxury sedan for his 21st birthday. I got a used hatchback that I had to share with my mother for a year. When Veronica wanted to spend a summer in Florence to find inspiration, my parents paid for the entire trip, apartment and all. When I needed help with a down payment for an apartment closer to my university, I was given a lecture on financial responsibility and a check for $500, which was presented as an act of immense generosity. I learned early on to be self-sufficient. I worked part-time jobs through college and my master's program. I scraped and saved. I took pride in my independence because, frankly, I had no other choice. I told myself it made me stronger, more resilient. I convinced myself that I didn't need their approval. But every time there was a family gathering, the old wound would be poked and prodded until it was raw again. A typical Sunday dinner was a master class in this dynamic. I remember one evening vividly, about a year before my wedding. I had just passed my final architectural licensing exam, a brutal multi-day test that was the culmination of nearly a decade of work. I was officially an architect. I walked into my parents' house, buzzing with my news, hoping for once to get a genuine congratulations. I found the family in the living room, listening with rapt attention as Gregory described his latest business pivot. So we're moving away from the B2C space and focusing on synergistic B2B solutions, he said, Jess. Touring with his hands. It's all about disrupting the vertical integration of the legacy platforms. My father nodded sagely. That's my boy, always thinking 10 steps ahead. You have to be aggressive in this market. Veronica chimed in. It sounds so brilliant, Greg. I was just telling my friend at the gallery how my brother is basically the next Steve Jobs. I waited for a pause in the worship session. I actually have some news, I said, a little too brightly. I passed my final exam. I'm officially a licensed architect. My mother looked up from her phone. Oh, that's nice, dear. We're so glad that's over with for you. My father clapped me on the shoulder distractedly. Good, good. That's a solid credential to have. He then immediately turned back to Gregory. Now, son, tell me about your cap table. We need to make sure your equity isn't too diluted before the next funding round. And that was it. My biggest professional achievement to date was dismissed in under 10 seconds. It was a nice thing, a credential. It wasn't genius or brilliant, it was just adequate. The rest of the dinner was more of the same. An hour was dedicated to Veronica's upcoming gallery show, which my parents had heavily sponsored. Another hour was spent dissecting Gregory's need for a new downtown office to impress potential investors. My accomplishment was a footnote, an afterthought. I drove home that night with a familiar hollow feeling in my chest. I vented to my then-boyfriend, David, who listened patiently, his brow furrowed with anger on my behalf. They don't see you, Marilyn, he said, taking my hand. They don't see how incredible you are, but I do. He was my rock. David was a high school history teacher, a man who found deep satisfaction in his work, in shaping young minds. He was grounded, kind, and completely unimpressed by the superficial world my family inhabited. He loved me for my mind, my drive, my resilience, all the things my family treated as secondary character traits. When he proposed a few months later on a quiet weekend trip to the coast, it felt like the first foundational stone of a new life, one I would build for myself, on my own terms. I was finally creating my own family, one where I wouldn't be the black sheep, but a cherished partner. I just didn't realize that my old family wasn't done trying to tear down my designs. The joy of our engagement felt like a protective bubble. For weeks, David and I were blissfully lost in our own little world, dreaming up a future and sketching out plans for a life together. We decided on a small, elegant wedding. We weren't interested in the kind of ostentatious display my parents would have preferred. We wanted something that felt like us, intimate, personal, and meaningful. Most importantly, we were paying for it ourselves. We had our own savings, and the idea of being financially beholden to my parents for my own wedding was unthinkable. The first step was to announce it to my family. I braced myself, hoping for the best but expecting the worst. We invited my parents, Gregory, and Veronica to a nice restaurant for an engagement dinner. I wanted to give them the news in a neutral, public space, hoping it might curb their worst impulses. The evening started with a tense civility. My mother, Alina, inspected the restaurant's decor with a critical eye. "It's a bit minimalist, isn't it?" she murmured, running a finger over the tablecloth as if checking for dust. My father, Arthur, grilled David about his job. "A history teacher, you say? Noble profession. Doesn't leave much room for advancement, though, does it?" David, bless his patient soul, handled it with grace. "I find a lot of value in my work, Arthur. Shaping the next generation is its own kind of reward." My father just grunted, unconvinced. Gregory and Veronica exchanged a look I knew all too well, a silent, smug communication that said, "Can you believe this guy?" I decided to cut to the chase before things could devolve further. "We have some wonderful news to share," I announced, my hand finding David's under the table. "David and I are getting married." I held my breath. For a fleeting moment, there was a flicker of something positive. My mother managed a tight smile. "Well, Marilyn, it's about time. Congratulations." "Yes, congratulations," my father echoed, though he was looking at David with an expression of clinical assessment, as if diagnosing a patient with a minor but chronic ailment. Gregory raised his glass. "To my little sister, finally tying the knot. And to David, welcome to the family, man, you're a brave guy." He said it with a laugh, but the undertone was clear. You have no idea what you're getting into. Veronica was the worst. "Oh, a wedding? How exciting," she gushed, her eyes already glazing over with visions of bridesmaid dresses and floral arrangements. "We absolutely must find you a designer. The venue you choose is everything, you know. It sets the NT. Ray tone, please don't pick somewhere drab." The conversation was immediately hijacked. It wasn't about our happiness or our future. It was about the project of the wedding. Eleanor and Veronica began a rapid-fire interrogation about our plans, each question laced with judgment. "You're not thinking of a summer wedding, are you?" "So cliché," Veronica said. "And you must have a proper wedding planner. You can't possibly manage this on your own, Marilyn, with your busy job," Eleanor insisted. "I actually enjoy planning, Mom. I'm an architect. Project management is what I do," I said, trying to keep my voice light. She waved her hand dismissively. "It's not the same, dear. This is about taste and social grace, not blueprints." The final, crushing blow came when the topic of the budget was broached. My father cleared his throat, adopting the paternal, lecturing tone he so often used with me. "Now, Marilyn, a wedding is a major expense. I hope you two have a realistic financial plan. Don't come to us expecting a blank check. We have other significant commitments." He glanced meaningfully at Gregory, who was in the process of trying to secure another round of funding for his startup. The implication was staggering. He was preemptively telling me not to ask for help, assuming I would, while simultaneously reminding me that my brother's speculative business venture was a more worthy commitment. "Don't worry, Arthur," David said, his voice firm and level. "We're paying for the wedding ourselves. We want it to be a reflection of our own hard work and our partnership." The look on my parents' faces was a strange mix of relief and, bizarrely, offense, as if our financial independence was a slight against them, a rejection of their control. But the defining moment of the evening, the one that would fester in my mind for weeks, came at the end. My father stood up to make a toast. He raised his glass of expensive wine, the wine he'd insisted on ordering. "To Marilyn and David," he began, and for a second I thought it might be sincere. "It brings a father great joy to see all of his children settled, Gregory building a business empire, Veronica making her mark on the art world." He paused, beaming at them. They preened under his praise. Then he turned to me. "And now Marilyn, our practical, steady Marilyn, has found someone. We are very happy she won't be alone. May your life together be as sensible as you are." He gave a small, condescending smile. "To the happy couple." The entire table clinked their glasses. The insult was so elegantly delivered, so wrapped in the guise of a blessing, that only David and I seemed to feel its sting. He didn't toast to my happiness, my career, or the wonderful person I was. He toasted to the fact that I had avoided the apparent fate of spinsterhood. He toasted to my sensibility as if it were a consolation prize. He defined my entire existence by my relationship status, while my siblings were defined by their grand, parent-funded ambitions. I felt a cold, hard knot form in the pit of my stomach. It was the culmination of a lifetime of being minimized, of being the afterthought. This wasn't just a clumsy toast. It was a declaration of my worth in their eyes, trivial. As we left the restaurant, my mother pulled me aside. "Don't be difficult about the wedding planning, dear," she whispered, patting my arm. "Let us help you make it presentable." In the car on the way home, I was silent, the rehearsed smiles and pleasantries of the evening finally falling away. David drove for a few minutes before pulling over to the side of the quiet road. He turned to me, his expression full of a loving fury. "That was unbelievable," he said, his voice low. The way they treat you is not okay, Marilyn. It's not just thoughtless, it's cruel. Tears I hadn't even realized were welling up began to fall. It's always been like this, I whispered. I just thought, for my engagement, for my wedding, I thought for once it might be different. I know, he said, pulling me into a hug. But we're a team now. We're our own family. We don't need their approval for anything. He was right. I leaned my head on his shoulder, the cold knot in my stomach slowly turning into something else. It was no longer just hurt. It was anger. A quiet, simmering anger that was starting to feel like resolve. My family had made their position clear. They saw my life, my love, and my future as a footnote in their grand family narrative. Fine, but the story wasn't over yet, and I was about to write a new chapter they would never see coming. The weeks following the engagement dinner were a quiet battleground. My mother and Veronica launched a full-scale assault on my wedding plans. They sent me unsolicited links to venues that were triple our budget. They created a Pinterest board titled "Marilyn's Wedding Needs Help" and shared it with me, filled with extravagant floral arrangements and designer gowns tea. Hat were completely contrary to my taste. Every phone call was a passive-aggressive campaign to wrestle control. A buffet, Marilyn, it's so impersonal. A seated dinner is the only civilized option, my mother would sigh. Are you really having a DJ instead of a live band? It can feel a bit like a high school prom, Veronica would comment, her voice dripping with faux concern. I held my ground, with David as my constant reinforcement. We politely declined their suggestions and continued planning the wedding we wanted. But their condescension, especially after my father's toast, had planted a seed of bitter curiosity in my mind. It wasn't just about their emotional neglect anymore. It was about the financial disparity that propped up the whole rotten system. My father's comment about their significant commitments echoed in my head. I had always known Gregory and Veronica were getting help. It was impossible to miss. Gregory drove a car he couldn't possibly afford on a startup founder's non-existent salary, and his downtown apartment was in one of the most expensive buildings in the city. Veronica's job as a gallery curator was a notoriously low-paying field, yet she lived a life of boutique shopping and international travel, which she flaunted on her social media. But I had never known the specifics. I had never allowed myself to dwell on the actual numbers, perhaps as a form of self-preservation. To quantify the favoritism would be to make it undeniably real, a solid wall of injustice I could no longer pretend wasn't there. Now, however, something had shifted. Their blatant disrespect at my engagement dinner had chipped away my denial. I needed to know. I needed to see the architecture of their lies. The opportunity came unexpectedly. My mother called me one afternoon in a manufactured panic. Marilyn, darling, your father and I are going away for the weekend to the lake house, and the decorators are coming on Monday to measure for new drapes. We completely forgot. Could you possibly pop over to the house and let them in? You have a key. It was a classic Aliner move, creating a minor inconvenience and framing it as a huge favor only I, the reliable one, could handle. Normally, I would have been annoyed. This time, I saw an opening. Of course, Mom, not a problem. What time are they coming? I asked, keeping my voice perfectly calm. On Monday morning, I let the decorators into my parents' house. They were professional and efficient, and I left them to their work, telling them to lock up when they were done. The house was quiet and empty. This was my chance. My heart hammered against my ribs, a mixture of guilt and grim determination propelling me forward. I wasn't just snooping, I was searching for the truth. I went straight to my father's home office. It was his sanctuary, a room of dark wood, leather-bound books, and an air of self-importance. I knew he was meticulous about his files. The question was, where would he keep something he didn't want anyone to see? I started with the main filing cabinet, pulling open drawers filled with old tax returns, mortgage documents, and car titles. It was all standard household paperwork. I was about to give up when I noticed a smaller, locked cabinet tucked away under the credenza. It was a simple lock, the kind you could probably open with a paperclip. But I had a better idea. I remembered that years ago, my dad had hidden a spare key to it on the underside of his heavy oak desk, held there by a piece of tape. He'd told a younger Gregory about it, boasting about his cleverness, not realizing I was sitting quietly in the corner, reading a book. On a whim, I knelt and ran my hand along the rough wood underneath the desk. My fingers brushed against a small, cold piece of metal. The key. My hands were shaking as I inserted it into the lock. It turned with a quiet click. I pulled open the drawer. It wasn't filled with scandalous secrets or hidden treasures. It was just a file box neatly labeled family investments. My breath hitched. I lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of folders, each with a name. Gregory Startup, Veronica Gallery Endowment, University Gregory, University Veronica, and one that made my stomach drop. University Maryland. I pulled out my folder first. It was thin. Inside was a copy of the single $500 check they had given me and a record of a small college fund they had started for me, which had paid for my first year of tuition before it was depleted. The total contribution to my future was meticulously documented, around $20,000. I appreciated that, I truly did, but I had a sinking feeling it would pale in comparison. Next, I pulled out Gregory's files. It was like opening a treasure chest. There was a folder for his university expenses, which were nearly double mine, including a generous monthly stipend. But the real bombshell was the startup folder. Inside were bank statements detailing a wire transfer from a joint investment account belonging to my parents. The amount was staggering, a single transfer of $250,000, labeled as Seed Investment G Enterprises. $250,000. It wasn't a loan, it was a gift. There were no repayment terms, no interest, nothing. It was just a colossal sum of money handed over to fund his vision. My hands felt numb. I reached for Veronica's folders. Hers was a similar story. Her out-of-state university costs were fully covered. And then, the gallery endowment folder. I found a signed agreement between my parents and the small, private art gallery where she worked. My parents had made a charitable donation to the gallery. The donation was for $120,000. The agreement stipulated that the funds were to be used to create and fund a junior curator position for a minimum of 3 years. A position that was, of course, filled by my sister, Veronica. They hadn't just helped her get a job, they had literally bought her one. I sat back on the floor of my father's office, the open folders spread around me. I did the math in my head, my mind struggling to process the scale of it. $250,000 for Gregory's business. $120,000 for Veronica's career. That was $370,000. $370,000. It was a number so large, so far beyond anything I had ever received or dared to ask for, that it felt like it belonged to a different reality. This wasn't just a little extra help. This was life-changing, foundational money. It was the kind of money that erased struggle, that bought opportunities, that built the gilded cages my siblings lived in. And it had been given freely, secretly, while I was praised for my sensibility and independence for not needing it. My independence wasn't a character trait they admired. It was a convenience they exploited. A cold, clarifying rage washed over me, displacing the hurt. This was the proof. This was the blueprint of their betrayal. I took out my phone and, with steady hands, began to take pictures of every single document. Every bank statement, every wire transfer confirmation, every signed agreement. Each photo was a click of a lock falling into place. I put everything back exactly as I had found it, locked the cabinet, and placed the key back under the desk. I walked out of that office not as the dutiful daughter, but as an investigator who had just uncovered the central lie of her entire life. I had the evidence. The only question now was what I was going to do with it. The days after my discovery were surreal. I went to work, I discussed wedding details with David, I lived my normal life, but it all felt like a movie playing in the background. My real focus was on the photos on my phone, the damning evidence that I now carried with me everywhere. The number $370,000 was burned into my brain. Initially, my anger was a wild, directionless fire. I wanted to scream at them, to confront them, to throw the evidence in their faces. But David, in his calm and methodical way, helped me channel that raw emotion into something more focused. "A direct confrontation will just turn into a shouting match," he said one evening as we sat in our living room, the city lights twinkling outside. "They'll deny it, they'll gaslight you, they'll call you ungrateful for everything they have done. You know how they are. They'll twist it until you're the villain for discovering it." He was right. My family were masters of emotional manipulation. A simple accusation, even with proof, wouldn't be enough. I needed more than just the what. I needed the why and the from where. As an architect, I know that you can't understand a structure without seeing the full set of plans. I needed the full financial blueprint. My investigation deepened. I started by looking closer at the photos I'd taken. The wire transfers had come from a specific investment account. I recognized the name of the financial institution. The account was in my parents' names, Arthur and Alina. But something else caught my eye on one of the statements. A small, almost unnoticeable line of text at the bottom referencing the A and E Grandchildren's Trust. A and E Arthur and Alina. No, that wasn't right. My paternal grandparents were Arthur S.R. and Elizabeth. My maternal grandparents were Alfred and Evelyn. A and E Alfred and Evelyn. This was a trust set up by my mother's parents. I had a vague memory of my grandmother Evelyn, a kind but formidable woman who had passed away when I was in high school. She was a pragmatist, a believer in fairness. She had always made a point of treating me, Gregory, and Veronica with absolute equality. She sent us each the same check for our birthdays, gave us each the same number of gifts during the holidays. The idea that she would create a trust that favored two of her grandchildren over the third seemed completely out of character. This was the thread I needed to pull. My next step was a bit more difficult. I needed information about the trust, but I couldn't ask my parents. I thought about who might know, who would be sympathetic. My mind landed on my Uncle Robert, my mother's younger brother. He was the family's other black sheep, an easygoing music teacher who had long been a quiet disappointment to his parents and his overachieving sister, Alina. We weren't close, but we shared a silent understanding of what it was like to be on the outside of the family's inner circle. I called him and asked if he'd be willing to meet for coffee. I was vague, just saying I had some family questions I was hoping he could help with. He agreed, his voice warm with curiosity. We met at a small cafe downtown. After some initial small talk, I took a deep breath and got straight to the point. "Uncle Robert," I started, "I need to ask you about a trust set up by Grandma Evelyn and Grandpa Alfred, the A and E Grandchildren's Trust." His eyebrows shot up in surprise. He took a slow sip of his coffee. "That's a name I haven't heard in a while," he said. "Your mother and father took over as trustees after Mom passed. Why are you asking about it?" I decided to be honest, at least partially. "I have reason to believe that my parents have been using the funds to help Gregory and Veronica financially," I said carefully. "A lot of help, and I was wondering what the original terms of the trust were." A knowing, sad smile touched his lips. "Ah," he said softly, "I'm not surprised. Your grandmother was very specific about that trust. She saw the way Alina and Arthur played favorites, even when you kids were little. It worried her." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. The trust was her attempt to level the playing field. The language in it was ironclad, or so she thought. It stipulated that the principal was to be invested and grown, and that funds could be distributed to her grandchildren for one of three specific life foundations, as she called them: post-secondary education, the purchase of a first home, or the establishment of a professional business. And this is the most important part. It explicitly stated that any distributions were to be made equally among the three of you. I felt the air leave my lungs. "Equally." "Absolutely," he confirmed. "If one of you received $1, the others were entitled to $1 for the same purpose when the time came. She wanted to ensure you all had the same start in life, regardless of who your parents' favorite was that week. Your mother was furious about the equality clause, but my mom wouldn't budge. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The money for Gregory's business, the money for Veronica's career, that hadn't just been my parents' money. It had been our money. My money. They hadn't just given my siblings a fortune, they had stolen my share of my inheritance to do it. Is there any way to get a copy of the trust document? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Uncle Robert thought for a moment. It would be difficult without going through your parents. But the trust would have been set up through my parents' estate lawyer. The firm is still around. I can give you the name. If you explain the situation, that you're a beneficiary who has been denied access to information by the trustees, they might be willing to help you. He wrote down the name and number on a napkin. It felt like a key. When I got home, I told David everything. He was speechless, his face a mask of cold fury. "This is more than just favoritism, Marilyn," he said, his voice tight. "This is fraud. This is a crime." The next day, I contacted the law firm. I was nervous, but my conversation with my uncle had emboldened me. I explained who I was and my concerns that the trustees, my parents, were not acting in accordance with the trust's terms. As a named beneficiary, I was legally entitled to see the document. After some back and forth with their legal department, they agreed. A week later, a thick envelope arrived by courier. I sat with David at our dining table and read through the legal jargon. But there it was, in black and white, exactly as my uncle had described. The purpose of the trust, the 3 life foundations, and the undeniable, unambiguous equality clause. It even outlined a process for what should happen if a beneficiary didn't use their funds for one of those purposes by a certain age. It was to be paid out to them as a lump sum. My parents hadn't just been unfair. They had deliberately violated the legal duties they had as trustees. They had taken my inheritance, my grandparents' final gift to me, and used it to pave the golden road my siblings walked on, leaving me to build my own path with gravel and dirt. The fire of my anger was no longer wild. It was a controlled, focused, and intensely hot flame. I had the documents. I had the bank statements. I had the motive. I had the entire story, from foundation to roof. My family hadn't just insulted my wedding, they had given me the perfect stage on which to reveal their crime. The plan began to form in my mind, a detailed, multi-layered blueprint for justice. And the centerpiece of it all would be my wedding reception. With the trust document in hand, the nature of my plan shifted. This was no longer just about exposing emotional hypocrisy. It was about reclaiming what was legally mine. My hurt had crystallized into a cold, hard resolve. I was an architect, and I was about to design the most important project of my life: the complete and utter demolition of my family's carefully constructed facade. David was my partner in this, my co-conspirator. He was the one who kept me grounded when my anger threatened to boil over. "We have to be smart about this," he'd say. "Strategic. We can't let them see it coming." Our first step was to consult with a lawyer, a friend of a friend who specialized in estate and trust litigation. We laid out the entire story in her quiet, book-lined office. The family dynamic, the discovery in my father's office, the trust documents. She listened intently, her expression growing more serious with each piece of evidence I presented. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. "Marilyn," she said, her voice firm, "what you have here is an incredibly strong case for breach of fiduciary duty. Your parents, as trustees, had a legal obligation to act in your best interest and according to the explicit terms of the trust. By distributing funds to your siblings without providing you your equal share, they have broken the law. Frankly, it's theft." Hearing it put so bluntly by a legal professional was validating. I wasn't being dramatic or ungrateful. I was a victim of a financial crime perpetrated by my own parents. "So what are my options?" I asked. "You could sue them," she explained. "We would file a lawsuit to have them removed as trustees and demand a full accounting of the trust. We would seek to recover your share of the distributions, which would be $370,000, plus interest and potentially damages." She paused. But litigation is a long, expensive, and emotionally draining process. It would permanently destroy your relationship with your family. I think that relationship is already destroyed, I said quietly. They just don't know it yet. The lawyer nodded. There is another option. We can use the threat of litigation as leverage. We prepare the entire case, gather the evidence, draft the complaint, but we don't file it immediately. Instead, we use a different tactic to force their hand. And that's when my wedding plan began to solidify. It wasn't just going to be an emotional confrontation. It was going to be the opening salvo in a legal battle they wouldn't even know had begun. The plan had 2 phases. Phase 1 was the public revelation. Phase 2 was the private, legal fallout. Over the next few months, as I finalized the details of my wedding, the flowers, the catering, the music, I was also secretly working with the lawyer. We drafted a formal legal demand letter to be sent to my parents the day after the wedding. It would outline their breach of duty, cite the specific clauses in the trust, include copies of the bank statements I had photographed, and demand the immediate payment of my $370,000 share, plus a calculated amount of interest for the years it had been denied to me. The total came to just over $412,000. The letter would state that if the funds were not transferred within 30 days, we would file the lawsuit and make the matter public. While the lawyer prepared the legal arsenal, I prepared for the public front. The wedding reception was the perfect venue. It would be a controlled environment, filled with extended family and my parents' friends, the very people they cared about impressing most. Their reputation was their most prized possession, and I was going to hold it hostage. I didn't want to ruin my entire wedding day with dread. David and I made a pact. The ceremony itself would be ours. It would be about our love, our vows, our future. We would be fully present in that moment, creating a beautiful memory that was untainted by the drama to come. The reception, however, was another story. That was the reckoning. My wedding speech became my primary focus. I wrote and rewrote it dozens of times. I didn't want it to be a hysterical, rambling accusation. It had to be delivered with the cool, calm precision of an architect presenting a design. It had to be factual, undeniable, and devastating. I also prepared a single, powerful visual aid. I wasn't going to project bank statements or legal documents. That would be too messy, too complicated. Instead, I created a simple, elegant PowerPoint slide. It had a clean, minimalist design. The title was A Grandparent's Gift, the A and E Trust. Below it were 3 columns. The first column had Gregory's name, with an icon of a briefcase, and below it the number, $250,000. The second column had Veronica's name, with an I. Con of a paintbrush, and below it the number, $120,000. The third column had my name, Marilyn, with an icon of a question mark, and below it the number, $0. It was simple, clear, and utterly damning. I arranged with the wedding venue's AV technician to have a projector and screen set up, under the guise of showing a photo montage of me and David, which we would do earlier in the evening. My slide was loaded and ready to be displayed with a single click from a remote I would keep in my pocket. In the final weeks leading up to the wedding, my family's behavior was more of the same. My mother fretted about the guest list. My father made condescending comments about the cost. Gregory and Veronica treated my wedding as a minor social obligation they had to attend. They had no idea they were walking into a perfectly designed trap. They saw me as the same old Marilyn, the quiet, sensible one who would swallow their insults and overlook their slights. They had fundamentally underestimated me. They saw an easy-to-read floor plan, not realizing there was a hidden, reinforced steel structure underneath. The day before the wedding, my mother called me for one last, pep talk. "Marilyn, I just want tomorrow to be a beautiful day," she said. "Please try to be gracious. Your father and I have done so much for all of you children. We just want you to be happy and grateful." The word hung in the air between us, grateful. "Don't worry, Mom," I said, my voice as smooth as glass. Tomorrow, everyone will know exactly what I have to be grateful for. Our wedding ceremony was perfect. Standing opposite David, under an arch of white roses and eucalyptus, I felt a profound sense of peace. In that moment, surrounded by the people who truly loved us, my toxic family faded into the background. We said our vows, our voices steady and full of emotion, and when we kissed, the applause from our friends was a wave of genuine joy that washed over us. For that half hour, none of the rest of it mattered. It was just us, starting our life. It was the foundation, solid and true. The reception began with the same warmth and happiness. The dining room was beautiful, filled with candlelight and laughter. David and I made our entrance, we had our first dance, and we moved from table to table, talking with our guests. I watched my family from across the room. They were in their element, holding court at their table. My father was pontificating to some of his old colleagues, my mother was smiling graciously, and Gregory and Veronica were laughing, looking beautiful and bored. They were performing their roles as members of the perfect family, celebrating the wedding of their less interesting sister. After the main course, the speeches began. The best man gave a funny, heartfelt speech about David. My maid of honor, my best friend since college, gave a beautiful toast that brought tears to my eyes. Then, my father stood up. He tapped his glass for attention, a smug smile on his face. He gave a polished, generic speech about the joys of fatherhood. He praised Gregory's business acumen and Veronica's artistic talent. When he got to me, it was a repeat of the engagement dinner toast, only this time for a larger audience. "And Marilyn, my wonderfully practical daughter," he said, gesturing toward me. "She has always been the responsible one, not one for flights of fancy, but dependable. We are so relieved and happy to see her so well settled with David, a fine young man." He raised his glass. "To the happy couple, may your future be secure and stable." He sat down to polite applause. The insults were subtle, veiled, but I felt them like pinpricks. Practical, responsible, settled, he made me sound like a safe municipal bond. I glanced at David, who gave me a small, determined nod. It was time. The MC announced that the bride would now like to say a few words. I stood up and walked to the microphone, the small remote for the projector clenched in my hand. The room quieted down. All eyes were on me. I started conventionally. "Thank you all so much for being here to celebrate with me and David," I began, my voice clear and steady. "It means the world to us to be surrounded by so much love." I smiled at my friends, at David's wonderful family. Then, I turned my gaze to my parents' table. I especially want to thank my family. My parents, Arthur and Alina, and my siblings, Gregory and Veronica. A wedding is a time when we reflect on family, on the foundations we are given, and the support that helps us build our lives. My mother beamed, likely thinking this was the grateful speech she had asked for. "My parents taught me the importance of being independent and self-sufficient," I continued, my eyes locked on them. "And it's a lesson I took to heart. I paid my way through school, I built my career from the ground up, and David and I are paying for this beautiful wedding ourselves. We are very proud of that." A few people clapped. My parents' smiles became a little more strained. But as I was planning for my future with David, I became curious about the past, about the different foundations provided to me and my siblings. I learned that building a life costs a lot of money. For example, launching a tech startup, I said, turning my head slightly toward Gregory, can be very expensive. Gregory's smile faltered. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "And securing a prestigious position in the art world," I went on, my gaze drifting to Veronica, "sometimes requires more than just talent. It requires a generous benefactor." Veronica's face went pale. Now for the final turn. My maternal grandparents, Alfred and Evelyn, understood this. They wanted to ensure all three of their grandchildren had the same strong start. So they created a trust, to be managed by my parents, to provide each of us with equal help for our education, our first homes, or our business ventures. My voice was calm, almost academic. I clicked the remote in my hand. The projector screen behind me, which had been showing a lovely photo of me and David, flickered and changed. My simple, devastating slide appeared in large, clear font for the entire room to see. A grandparent's gift, the A&E Trust. Gregory, briefcase icon, $250,000. Veronica, paintbrush icon, $120,000. Marilyn, question mark icon, $0. A collective gasp went through the room. Whispers erupted like wildfire. I let the image hang in the air for a moment of deafening silence. My father stood up abruptly, his face purple with rage. "Marilyn, what is the meaning of this? Turn that off." I ignored him, speaking into the microphone. "The meaning, Dad, is that for my entire life, you called me the practical, responsible one. You praised me for my independence, but what you really meant was that I was the convenient one, the one you could ignore because my siblings' ambitions were more important. You didn't just give them a better start. You took my inheritance, my grandparents' gift to me, and you gave it to them." My mother was staring at the screen, her face a mask of horror and disbelief. "Marilyn, this is a private family matter," she hissed, her voice loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "It stopped being a private matter when you gave away $370,000 of my money," I said, my voice ringing with newfound power. "It stopped being a private matter when you toasted to my sensibility while you were funding their dreams. And it's certainly not a private matter anymore." I looked out at the stunned faces of our guests, then back at my family. Gregory looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Veronica was on the verge of tears. "So, I want to make one final toast," I said, raising my glass. "To my new family, to my husband David, who loves me for who I am, not for what I can do for him, and to my grandparents who believed in fairness even if their trustees did not." I looked directly at my parents. "Thank you for the wedding gift of clarity. It's the most valuable thing you've ever given me." I put the microphone down. The silence in the room was absolute. Then, from the back of the room, my Uncle Robert slowly stood up and started to clap. A few seconds later, my maid of honor and her table joined in. Then David's family. Soon, nearly half the room was applauding, not for a bride's speech, but for a moment of shocking, undeniable truth. My father, speechless with fury, grabbed my mother's arm and stormed out of the reception hall. Gregory and Veronica followed moments later, their heads down in shame. My work was done. Phase 1 was complete. The rest of the wedding reception was a strange, surreal affair. The departure of the royal family left a vacuum that was quickly filled with a bizarre mixture of excitement and support. People I hadn't spoken to in years came up to hug me. Cousins shared their own stories of my parents' favoritism. David's family looked at me with a newfound level of respect and awe. My maid of honor popped a bottle of champagne at our table and said, "That was the most legendary thing I have ever witnessed." David and I did our best to enjoy the rest of our party. We cut the cake, we danced with our friends, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly light, as if a 30-year weight had been lifted from my shoulders. We had created a clear line in the sand. On one side was the toxic, manipulative world of my parents. On the other was our future, built on honesty and mutual respect. As expected, my phone started buzzing before we even left the venue. A string of furious texts from my mother. "How could you humiliate us like that? You are an ungrateful, vindictive child. You have destroyed this family." Then came the voicemails from my father, each one more apoplectic than the last, filled with threats and blustering rage. I didn't listen to them. I simply powered my phone off. David and I left for our honeymoon in Hawaii the next morning. We spent 2 weeks in paradise, completely unplugged from the world. We hiked, we swam, we talked about everything but my family. It was a period of healing, a chance to solidify the foundation of our new life together. It was the first time I felt genuinely free. We knew, however, that the real battle was waiting for us back home. The public shaming was just the beginning. Phase 2 was the legal checkmate. The day after we returned, rested and resolute, our lawyer sent the demand letter via courier to my parents' house. It was a cold, formal document that laid out their breach of fiduciary duty in excruciating detail. It referenced the trust, the specific distributions made to Gregory and Veronica, and the total amount owed to me. $370,000 in principal, plus a carefully calculated sum for lost investment growth, bringing the grand total to $412,854.32. The letter gave them a non-negotiable deadline of 30 days to wire the full amount to a trust account set up by my lawyer. If they failed to comply, the lawsuit would be filed, and the documents, including the bank statements and the trust agreement, would become a matter of public record. The silence from their end was immediate and absolute. The angry texts and voicemails stopped. For 2 weeks, we heard nothing. I started to get nervous, but our lawyer assured us this was a good sign. "They're talking to their own lawyer," she said, "and any competent lawyer will tell them they have no choice. They were caught red-handed. Fighting this in court would be a public relations nightmare and a financial disaster for them." She was right. On the 28th day, just 2 days before the deadline, my lawyer received a call from their attorney. They wanted to negotiate. Our lawyer's response was simple: "There is nothing to negotiate. Pay the full amount or we'll see you in court." Faced with total defeat, they folded. The next day, the full amount, $412,854.32, was wired into the trust account. It was over. I had won. The money felt like a strange artifact from another life. It wasn't a lottery win or a gift. It was justice. It was my grandmother's final wish, fulfilled at last. David and I used a large portion of it as a down payment on a beautiful piece of land just outside the city. It was the perfect spot to build our own home. I have not spoken to my parents, Gregory, or Veronica since my wedding day. My Uncle Robert told me that the fallout in their social circle was catastrophic. The story spread like wildfire. My father and my mother were now seen as frauds.